Before implementing user following and followers, we first need to link users with relationships. Let's look at our diagram again. Here the relationship between a user and user.following is has many through active relationships. So that means that a user has many active relationships, and conversely, each of these relationships belongs to a user. Indeed, it belongs to a follower and to a followed user. So this record, for example, would belong to this user and would also belong to the followed user, in this case, over here. Let's take a look at the user model. And we also want to look at the newly generated relationship model. So here at the top, we've got has many microposts. So we're going to do this, has many. Now you might think we're going to do has many relationships, but remember, we're modeling two different kinds of relationships, these active relationships and passive relationships. So we're starting with active. So we're going to do has many active relationships. But this won't work by default because this here, has many microposts, tells Rails to look for a class called micropost. And that does exist. Right, there's a micropost model right here. But there's no active relationship model. Instead, there's a relationship model. So what we need to do is tell Rails the name of the class with an argument here. Class name relationship. In addition, over here with the micropost model, you might recall that there was a user ID to link the users to microposts. But now we have two different IDs. We have follower ID and followed ID. As I mentioned briefly in the last lesson, the user ID in the micropost table is called a foreign key. In this case, the foreign key will depend on whether we're talking about active relationships or passive relationships. Let's take a look at the diagram again. In order to make the user.following collection, we need this active relationships, and in this case, what identifies this user is in this column here, the follower ID column. So that's the foreign key in this context. That's the thing that links this user to this table. So here we need to tell Rails this is the class name relationship and foreign key. Follower ID. In this case here, we didn't have to tell Rails the name of the foreign key because by default it's just based on the user class. So a user model corresponds to a user ID. But in this case, follower does not correspond to a model, so we have to tell Rails explicitly. And finally, if the user is destroyed, any relationship should also be destroyed. So let's make this dependent destroy. Meanwhile, in the relationship model, we want the analog of this belongs to user. So we can do that here. We want belongs to follower. That tells us which user is the follower here, so it goes back through this association. But in micropost, when we said belongs to user, Rails knew by convention that that referred to the user model. Here, there is no follower model, so we have to tell Rails which class it is. And even though we won't need it right away, the symmetric case of followed is convenient to implement now. Just do this followed. Let's take a look at a table of some of the things this gives us. For any relationship, there's a follower and a followed right here. Corresponds to this. This would be the follower, and this would be followed. We can also create and build relationships through the association, as we did with microposts. Now there's a lot going on here, so don't worry if this is a little confusing right now. We'll be covering it in more detail when we build the web interface later in this lesson.